Hopefully everybody's well rested after last night. My voice is a little raspy, not usually. My voice doesn't usually sound like this. Lots of yelling last night, but anyways, glad you guys could make it. I'm John Truesdell. I'm MBA from 2010, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Anjali Sastry. She's a senior lecturer in system dynamics at MIT Sloan. Professor Sastry investigates in organizational managerial effectiveness in practical domains where challenges are complex and needs are pressing. Our expertise lies in three areas: system dynamics, particularly applied to organizational change and evolution, global health, and action learning. Some of us know her from Global Lab for healthcare. I didn't have the privilege to take it, even though I ended up in healthcare. This guy over here, he actually ended up in data and somehow got in that class. But her research translates into teaching innovations at MIT Sloan, where she teaches both system dynamics and global health. She leads 50 students, like I said, in the Global Lab that partners with enterprises on the front lines of delivering healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa, India. And Professor Sastry has joined us today to discuss the insights she and her co-author, Kara Penn, MBA 2007, have gained from the field-tested ideas and MIT alumni stories of how innovative leaders and entrepreneurs design projects with a key idea in mind of maximizing the usefulness of every failure. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sastry.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for making it to a relatively early morning session. I'm very glad to see you here. I myself am an alum. I was an undergrad in course 8, physics. I got another degree, believe it or not, in Russian from MIT, because I just realized I had enough credits. And then eventually I got my PhD in system dynamics. And I joined the faculty here in 2001. So it was a really nice homecoming to come back. And traditionally I did my sort of traditional teaching when I first came back to Sloan, system dynamics. Some of you, have you taken the class? Anyone here? You remember? Stocks and flows, graphical integration. I love that stuff. It's unique. It's incredibly powerful. But after a few years of doing that, number one, it was very hard to look good next to John Sturman because he's so fabulous. Number two, I was actually really wondering, are we equipping people to not only do great analysis, thought, and modeling, but go out in the world and take effective action? I became really interested with that piece, in part because I looked at research that had been emerging about the effectiveness of the MBA degree and its impact on the world, because MIT, as it often does, was taking a chance to look at itself and its own educational approaches, and the time was ripe to explore new ideas. And because students were asking me for it. I actually held a series of focus group discussions with students in 2006 and 2007, asking them, what do you think we need to add to your learning experience here that would equip you to be more effective in the world? And one of the things they said is, we do a ton of stuff outside the classroom. We have all these sort of passion projects we do. Why can't we get credit for them, basically? So it's not that easy. I can't just give you credit for extracurricular activities, but maybe we should experiment in this domain. So I tried a ton of different experiments. And my early ones, several of them failed, some of them quite badly. For instance, in one set of projects, I said, bring your passion and we'll work on something that's your passion. But actually what I was doing was creating projects where students were their own clients. So then when things got busy, they would just scale back on their goals so that they could report that they'd achieved something. So I actually decided, this is very military, you like this, John? I had this chart I called the Delta that we did every week. It's like you had to report to plan, like here's where I thought I'd be and here's where I am. And it was like the most depressing class because every week we just looked at this delta. Eventually the delta grew small because we all kind of managed to the system we're in. But in the students' case, it was because their goals eroded, not because they worked harder. It wasn't that they didn't want to work harder. It was that they're treating themselves as a client was just lower on the priority than treating anyone else as a client. So that was really interesting. And maybe that has some implications as you think ahead to your own kind of personal projects. right? How do you manage yourself to this goal when you're willing to do everything to meet someone else's expectations, but you sort of trade in sometimes on your own? Anyway, this led me to something my colleagues had already discovered, that it's really powerful to offer learning experiences to students where there's an external stakeholder asking for something and waiting to hear something. This is not news. And in fact, a huge amount of research on learning shows, especially in adults, I don't know if this is good or bad, kids love learning for the sake of learning. Adults tend to need to know, like, why is this important? Meaning is incredible, and relevance is incredibly important for adults. And so we know that to create these sort of pivotal learning experiences for adults, you need to connect it to something that's very meaningful to them. And so having projects that are driven by an external party is one great way to really focus in on learning, make it meaningful, invest more effort. Investing more effort generates more insight. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other theories I draw on in the next few minutes. But to finish this part of the story, I then decided, I tried this new effort. I would go around MIT, as you guys know, there's like amazing talks being given all the time, amazing events. And I decided I would just spend a few months going around MIT and attending every big open talk given by someone from within MIT or outside and see where everyone seemed most engaged. Because I decided that's where I was going to focus my new teaching innovation. We'd take a topic that everyone seemed to really care about. So I figured then I'd be able to negotiate this social compact with my students that would let me really drive home the learning by doing piece I was interested in exploring. And so I went to many different talks, and I had some great students. Like, I remember I went to a whole talk on the lolcat phenomenon. It was viral. Why was it viral? The room was actually packed with students, but I decided I can't really do a whole course on why cat videos have made the internet the way they are. But I did discover when I went to a talk given by Paul Farmer, who founded Partners in Health, that was an area where students were incredibly passionate. The room was completely full, one of the biggest lecture halls at MIT. And then like every student followed him out of the room asking, how can we work with you? So I decided this was an area, which was a little bit bold because we don't have a medical school. We don't have a school of public health. We don't even have a standalone policy school at MIT. But I decided I would go into global health, because this was an area where students seemed to have a passion, and I really wanted my teaching to respond to student passions. I contacted Paul and his co-founder, Jim Kim, and used the dialogue with them and with some MIT alums, actually. Jeff Shames helped me with this, to structure a series of talks here at Sloan that I then used to launch Global Health Lab. And so that I started in 2008. And I'll tell you a bit about that course. And then there's a sort of parallel story to that course that informed my thinking about failing better. Remember, I started by thinking about how do we equip students who are not only great in the classroom or on their problem sets, but great out in the world and have all the tools and equipment they need to go forward. I started becoming very interested in understanding how people learn from action and from experience. And so as I developed these other courses and then Global Health Lab, I was constantly running tests, experiments, and exploring ideas about how to equip people to learn from their own experience. So we live in a world where we sort of, on the one hand, argue that experience is a great teacher, but talk to anyone in any organization and they'll say, at some level, we're not really learning well from our own experience. You know, we repeat the same mistakes, so we get stuck in the same dysfunctional patterns. This seems to be a sort of ground truth of the world, that we both learn, we give experience a lot of due, and we harness it in various informal ways, and at the same time, we're all painfully aware about how much we're not learning from experience, sometimes individual, but certainly extremely often collectively, whether it's in the team or in the firm or even in the country, right? So how do we better learn from experience was something I kept thinking about. And as I worked on my teaching, I decided I would do some parallel research. So I tapped into some of that, and I'll tell you about that as we go. the book that I ended up writing was supposed to be a book about global health, but ended up being, oddly enough, a book about failure. So I sit at Sloan as a senior lecturer I haven't taught system dynamics for a couple of years now, but I teach in the GEM department, so I teach global health in the Global Economics and Management group. I also now have a position at the Harvard Medical School where I do research and teach. And this summer, I'm sitting in Mumbai. So I've actually just come back for a few days, in part to give this talk, working with Tata Trust, which is the largest philanthropy in India. And we're really looking at putting some of the ideas I'm going to be talking about into what Tata does. So that's exciting. So my other title for today's talk is What I Learned from Students, some of them in the room, alumni and innovators, all the way from Grand Rapids to Dhaka in Bangladesh. And I thought I'd start with a couple of core sort of observations that maybe seem very obvious to you, but I think they're worth flagging and putting out there. One of them is that if you think about it, for any professional, the unit of innovation is the project. The project is something that's got a kind of deliverable, timeline, set of inputs and team members, and also a set of constraints. And every time you want to do something better or different, you've got a project. You can't really improve the world without a project. So I'm going to use the project as the unit of thinking. But projects have kind of, there's a deep expertise on how to structure, manage, and use projects in many different disciplines. But I believe that people haven't really looked at projects as the core idea in innovation and as the unit by which the domain in which each of us can actually learn as we learn during our work experience and on the job. So how do we use projects for both learning and innovation? I think it's a really good question. So we need to go beyond kind of standard project management tools and loop in some thoughts, and you'll see some trails in here that emerge from systems thinking and from some of the more recent research on startups and design thinking as well. But let's elevate the humble project and not relegate project management to this kind of technical, boring thing. It's actually the stuff of how we get stuff done, and it's the stuff of how we turn ideas into action, how we learn from our own experience, I'd argue, and how we innovate. So recasting projects as central to innovation is one of my kind of core themes. The advantage for me of doing this is that I can actually look at explicitly now for parallels between my student projects and projects I see in the workplace and try to tease out what I can learn from my own research and experiments. How does that link? How is it similar or different from projects in the workplace? I became quite interested in that question. And as you know, Sloan students, I'm teaching Sloan fellows as well as EMBAs, and in custom exec ed programs, we have students who run the gamut, who, from undergrads who may be even teenagers, all the way to folks who are mid and late career. So we actually can tap into projects of a huge variety just working with the people we see here at Sloan. So we have a really rich domain to tap into, which means that we can actually understand projects in a very wide sense. Okay, so again, obvious ideas, number 2, but anytime you seek to innovate, you run the risk of failure. By definition, you're trying to do something new, there's got to be a chance things won't work out as you imagine they will. This book, which I didn't bring stupidly, but anyway, Fail Better has fail in very big font on the front cover of it. It was published by Harvard Business Press in October. And Harvard usually translates most of their business books into Spanish. They told me this book would not translate because in the Spanish-speaking world, people would not want to walk around with a book that had the word fail on the cover in such a big font. So it's quite interesting to learn that in many settings, even just talking about failure is a sort of no-go. And I've been in India a lot lately, so I've been giving talks to folks there. And after my last few weeks there, talking to people from all walks of life, I realized all across India, it's every parent's fantasy that they have a child who never fails. So I started asking this question when I walk into a business. What kind of company and what kind of country are we building here if we actually all want to have children who have never failed? How are we going to innovate? But that kind of mismatch between wanting failure and then wanting innovation and sort of espousing, as we do in the US, failure, or in other places, not even talking about it, and then our ability to actually use failure. That mismatch is glaring. As a sidebar, failure is clearly having a moment, right? We get everyone in Silicon Valley talking about their pro-failure philosophies. We have fail cons, fail fests, failure parties. Would-be execs even have failure resumes. Did you know this? Now you can polish up your own. Like, there's a whole meme about like how much we love and embrace failure. But at the same time, I mean, this being America, I'm sure we're going to see a backswing and a kind of resistance emerging to this idea that failure is good. Because without some kind of discipline and rigor, the notion to embrace failure is clearly stupid, if not dangerous, right? Just failure qua failure is absurd. The only value in failure is if it teaches you something you couldn't learn any other way. And so I became also really interested in this idea of what are those other ways first? Like, let's make sure that we've exhausted all the other options first. And then we have a specific set of criteria for the failure we seek to support. And then we figure out how to learn from them. So I'll go through that shortly. Now, research on learning and cognition shows that the experience of failure triggers learning in a way that the experience of success does not. There's a ton of evidence behind this. And it sort of lies at the intersection between cognition and emotion. So the feeling of a failure triggers a deeper level of critique of your mental models. You examine means-ends connections in newer and deeper ways than you do if you have a success. So if you have a success, people tend to choose one explanation for the success and move on. If you have a failure, people are willing to dig deeper, by and large. Now, there's a hypothesized, you guys might remember even learning about the famous Yerkes-Dodson curve. So there's a hypothesis that if you have too much stress or too much negativity, that's also hampers performance. And the same may be true for learning. So too little failure and you don't think deeply, too much failure and your, fight or flight response or self-preservation is triggered and you're not really thinking. So an interesting idea for me as an instructor and for you as managers, leaders, and I guess for all of us as parents is how do you scale that failure the right way so that the failure triggers learning but doesn't overwhelm. So it gets noticed and acted upon but doesn't send you, into some kind of despair spiral. So failure triggers learning but only if you do it right. And doing it right is not that easy. Doing it right is something we don't really talk about. And if you think about it, actually, here's another idea I've come through in the last couple of years talking to lots of folks, is that we don't really teach ourselves or learn how to analyze and talk about a failure in a professional way. Certain disciplines and areas do it. So if you enter certain professions, you might learn how to examine and look at a failure, albeit usually in a very structured and specific way. But by and large, at B schools, college, in high schools, we don't teach people how to tell a story of a failure and talk about it in a kind of professionally appropriate way that allows you to pull out shareable insights, to go beyond the kind of personal mea culpa, whatever that piece is, to go into here's my analysis or here's a working hypothesis, here's what I think is happening. Now, some disciplines, as I said, do have very well-honed methods. Anyone here who's a doctor knows about the practice of M&M, reviews after a surgery or a medical intervention has gone poorly, looking back on it and trying to figure out what happened. The military has a lot to teach us about this too. I worked with the US military, JTF-9 in Haiti right after the earthquake. And this is me actually with a team from Lincoln Labs, my students and the military, where we were doing weekly briefings. But then at the end of this process, which was only a few months, but felt incredibly long and hard, we did an after-action review. And that is a very structured process. Again, our friends here can tell us more about it. But in the after-action review, everyone goes into a room. They say stripes at the door. We actually left our computers and phones outside and spent a whole day digging into everything that happened during this about 3 months of intensive work in Haiti. What went well, what didn't, where did we mess up? What are the lessons? And the military's had to figure out something that many other disciplines need to do too, which is in the aftermath of a given experience, you need to pull out some insights knowing that they're provisional. You've got an N of 1, right? So you don't yet know for sure, but you suspect that a given explanation might hold or a given phenomena might be playing out. And you treat that as a kind of working hypothesis that you can pay attention to next time round, learn more about. And eventually, when multiple teams pull out similar aligned insights, you can test them systematically, proactively. And then once there's some evidence that's mounted up about this particular idea, you can turn it into doctrine and actually follow its advice. And in lots of other places, I find people are unsure about how strongly to weight the lessons of a given experience. Because you don't have the gold standard that academic researchers always talk about in most of your work experience. You simply don't have a big sample size, or you don't have a control case. You've just got one experience that played out one way, and you don't have the test against which to put it to know whether or not everything you think might have caused this outcome is actually holding in that particular situation. So how you learn from small sample sizes and don't sort of overlook potential insights while not ignoring them, while not overweighting them. I think that's a fascinating challenge and something I'd like to investigate in real-world projects going forward. How do you pull out provisional insights that are shareable, allow others to explore them themselves, and create a shared data bank of emerging insights that you can keep adding to as new data arises and as new experiences unfold, so that eventually you can actually form some confidence that you've got something you understand and something you would live by. Now, the ideas that inform my class, I'm going to talk a bit about the class and then go back to general methods for learning from failure, because the class, I think, will help you understand some of the context. The classes that I've taught here have relied on an idea that we developed probably about 12 years ago, which Dick used to call getting stuff done. We thought it would be really important to have a really simple framework that we could use to look at our curriculum and remind students about. It starts with action. So here's the standard pitch. MBA students have a bias for action. They want to get out and do things, which is why I love working with and teaching MBA students. We're not going to sit here and argue about angels on the head of a pin. We're going to come up with some ideas, and then go out and do them. All great. How can we use that bias for action to really, first of all, get students to build a habit of gathering data as they go? It's an extremely kind of unsexy thing to document your work as you go along, to scrape down both quantitative and qualitative data that maybe doesn't look very conventional, but gather it together, store it effectively, and then have everyone on your team look at it and wrestle with it together. But that's become a core piece of what we do in action learning. Not just go out and do stuff, but go out and do stuff while gathering data as you go, so you can come back and talk to us about what you see. Then we can analyze it. So linking action with data, incredibly important. And then being able to frame how the action you're taking is linked to your knowledge, ideas, and eventually we could frame this as hypotheses. Again, I've asked students, why did you do this? Why did you go and try this out in the field? Or why did you propose this idea to the partners you're working with? And often they'll say it's common sense, or we sat down together and decided. I would like people to be a little more thoughtful and say, actually, I took this pricing class and I learned that you need to think about people in this way, or that there's this certain approach to segmenting the market. And that idea triggered this thought. So I've tried to get students to excavate, what theories, frameworks, models, what grounding informs that action or hypothesis that they're generating. Again, it doesn't come very easily often to students, and they, as well as us, tend to compartmentalize subjects. So if I'm doing a class on global health, they're not necessarily dredging up and making explicit ideas they learned in a pricing class. But it's incredibly important if we want to deliver a stellar education to make that linkage for several reasons. The students need to be aware of and reflective on the professional practice and academic grounding for what they're doing, so that they can teach others, so that they can test it and refine their understanding of it. And by the way, so they can come back and tell us, what you taught us in pricing is totally irrelevant in Kenya, because it doesn't apply when you have urban poor of this profile, right? So that could be a two-way street for all of us to learn from experience. So I also became really interested in that piece. And again, flipping it over into the world of practice, how do you in your organizations, with the people you work with, get them to not only take action, but to gather data as they go, even if the data includes informal or unconventional data, in such a way that it's amenable to examination, critique, and reflection? And how do you get your colleagues and reports to look at what the reasons behind what they're doing and actually query whether they're grounded in something that has an evidence base behind it or not? This is part, by the way, of a larger trend in management research, trying to really push for evidence-based management practices to link the world of management research to the world of management practice. We certainly see it happening in domains like medicine, where evidence-based medicine is, no one would argue that's a good idea. But in management, I think we still have a ways to go to really driving home the value of evidence-based practices in our lived daily lives. Two more pieces in our learning model. The preparation is understanding how the disciplines, theories, and tools of the coursework here informs action, but also getting students to really think carefully before they take action about an explicit plan or hypothesis. Remember I said earlier that learning is triggered by the experience of appropriately scaled failure? Surprises fit in that category too. So we learn much more when we're surprised by something. The surprise is what triggers us to think. But it turns out that those surprises are not very evident unless you're actually juxtaposing your prior expectation with what you actually see. How do you do that? Without a little bit of planning and hypothesizing, we're just living in the stream of what we're doing minute by minute, and our reflection and juxtaposition of expectation versus experience is happenstance. But if you get people to write down or somehow explicitly formulate hypotheses, plans, and expectations, and then kind of force them to confront that mismatch, you've triggered opportunities for learning. I argue this kind of learning can happen in any place. It can happen, in the classroom, it can happen in the field, it can happen in the workplace. How do you trigger those surprise moments that lead you to reflect, discuss, cogitate, maybe rethink what you're doing, so that maybe you can discover new things earlier than you would otherwise? So forming hypotheses and making plans, again, that doesn't come easily to these bias for action folks necessarily, is a really important strategy for becoming more mindful about how you learn from your own lived experience. And then the third piece, which is usually the most painful with my students, is looking back on your experience to say, what have you learned from it? Why? Because we're so excited about action. Sometimes I can actually get the preparation in because it's the lead up to the action. So I say, you've got to do this planning. You've got to write out your mental model. You've got to lay out your theories because you're about to take action. But once they've taken the action, coming back to say, what do we learn from it, doesn't have the same allure as the next new exciting project. And this happens in our workplaces too. It's not even just our own psychological drives for this. It's also just the reality of there's another project waiting in the wings. We don't fund people to spend forever looking back on what they just did. We fund you to go do stuff. So where does that reflection come in? Without reflection, we're missing this whole kind of value of experience piece. And I think one challenge here, just like the sort of boilerplate about we learn from failure, everyone says we should reflect more, but without a better, more rigorous definition of reflection, this could just be navel gazing, right? You could just be sitting in a room and talking about feelings or whatever. Important though that is, I don't want to belittle that. But I also want to say that there's value to a structured, rigorous method of looking back on your experience and pulling out insights from it. For instance, I've found that in a lot of organizations that purport to reflect and learn from experience, they're often not doing strong or good assessments of the quality of the project that was just done. So every project gets the same level of scrutiny, and the so-called lessons learned acquire the same weight. But if some projects were duds and others were great, shouldn't we be drawing different level inferences from them? So we're not even doing that. In most organizations, there isn't a much thought given to how we say this project was amazing because it delivered on these attributes, and now we're going to systematically look at where that came from. Versus this project was middle of the road, they did what they were told, let's see if there's any, really outstanding things we can glean, but we don't necessarily need to unpack it. And this project was horrible, and that's why we really need to unpack the drivers of that. So sort of calibrating your lessons learned approach based on the quality of the project, I think is a really important piece. I'll return to that in a moment. But the last point I wanted to make here is that we often treat reflection as a very internal thing, like sit together and think about what you learned, or write a personal reflection essay. That's a standard academic assignment. I think there's huge value in working out what you learned by talking to others. And in fact, if we want to fail better, we've got to be able to take those insights and share them within the organization, within the team, the organization, maybe even the industry. Too often, these behaviors are not rewarded by companies. They're seen as self-serving. If you say, hey guys, I went out there and figured out a way to shave so many weeks off the standard process, or how to eliminate this weekly meeting, or how to add the, you're just seen as like, why are you doing this? This is not your job. So firms don't really reward people for going out there and sharing insights. We need to think about ways to legitimize this. And in the book, there's some great stories. One of my big ideas for the book was it would only feature Sloan alums. Did I tell you this? So it's going to be stories of MIT and Sloan alums in their work lives and how they did some of this. But we have a great story of Elizabeth Yin, an MIT Sloan alum, whose first startup failed. And whose second startup, she decided, even as she was working on each step of it, she would pull out insights and share them with others. And she started talking to peers and pulling out sort of working hypotheses for what she was seeing. And that act of saying, here's what I think I'm seeing, here's what I'm going to be doing in the next phase of my company, that act of telling the story helped refine her thinking. So it's not just PR or self-promotion. The act of reflecting hones your professional practice. And in fact, the amazing Don Schoen, who was in our urban studies department and a great thinker on the role of the professions, often argued this, that the mark of a professional was the ability to reflect on their practice. But I think we haven't gotten very far on how we actually do that in today's work world, and how we teach people, and how as managers and leaders we make space for ourselves and others to do that. But here at Sloan, we've really worked to put that reflection piece in. But I've struggled with it. And in my course design, for a while, I had students prepping and then going into the field during IAP. And then they come back in January, and I had another 6 weeks of course. And they'd been in Africa or Nepal or whatever for a month, and then coming back and sitting in the classroom and talking more for 6 weeks just seemed like completely ridiculous to them. That was a very hard sell for me to make. So how do you make that reflection efficient, compelling, meaningful, as important and valuable as the other steps of the process? I think that's one of our big challenges. Oh, here's just some students. The preparing, the acting, that's, I took that picture in Zambia, and then reflecting. And we have used student-to-student methods as well as with informal methods as well as more formal ones. I've done, as John mentioned, in Global Health Lab, which I've originally was part of G-Lab and now was a standalone course, I've done about 75 projects in the most challenging settings. So this idea was, students, you're going to get to go and live and work in a place you probably never would have otherwise. It's going to be an extremely challenging project. And because of that, we're going to go all out on all 3 steps: preparation, action, reflection. We're going to arrive having done our homework, having thought through the ideas, having formulated hypotheses, knowing what to look for. When we arrive, students have to actually make a change in concert with the staff and collaborators on site within 4 days. So now we actually usually, by the Friday of the first week, we often have data coming in about whether or not we're making things better. And then you've got to pull out what you've learned to share it with the partners in the field, with next year's students and beyond, and to serve your own professional development. Because this is an expensive, risky, and difficult class. And we're imposing on the poorest of the poor to do these projects because we go into the most low-resource settings. So we'd better deliver on all fronts. And that model of learning has proved very powerful. So I think those elements all fit together really well. So the 75 projects have put us into all kinds of places, from hospitals and NGOs in the developing world to startups. We worked with some tech startups as well as device firms that are entering low-resource markets. We've worked with the public sector, from hospitals to clinics, and learned a ton. I don't have time today to go into all of them, but I'm happy to talk about these projects later on and tell you more about any of them. But I'll tell you a little bit about the process and give you a flavor of a couple of the projects. Have you guys seen these explainer videos? You know, the hand-drawn whiteboard ones. So I got one of those made. That was pretty fun. So I took some still shots from the explainer video. So the way that we designed the course was to pick a focal challenge that fit into a bucket, like a strategy or a marketing or an ops challenge. It had to be proposed by the frontline leaders or managers themselves rather than headquarters or a third party or whatever. And then we would scope and develop these projects collaboratively. And when I've been able to, I actually have a staff that helps develop and scope these projects. We often go to the site before the project, meet the people, really try to understand the challenge they're facing. That investment seems like it is a big investment, but we can deliver a really good project if we invest on the front end. In our case, these projects are around 1,000 person-hours per project in direct work from students and the mentor. And then we've done a lot of follow-up. So in the last few years, I actually, this is a sidebar note, but I looked at the research on action learning in the world, especially project action learning courses like mine that say we're going to learn and we're going to help. We're doing research on the learning front. I discovered no one has researched whether we actually help. Like, if we say we're there for social good or to support social entrepreneurship or to help healthcare delivery, have we helped? Nobody studied that. So we've got to do that. Because we're telling our students, you've got to go out there and measure impact. We'd better do that ourselves. So I went back to the first 50 or so sites, 1, 2, and 3 years later, to ask them, did we help or hurt? Actually, the first question is, do you remember what we did? It's really interesting. You could probably predict this. Most student decks end with 17 ideas at the end, right? We think they'll usually only remember one. So there's only really, but the truth is, you can't predict which one necessarily. So most people didn't remember everything we did. On the flip side, things we had no idea would have an impact did. And by and large, overwhelmingly, we delivered far more help than we realized. Most places reported better performance in terms of cost effectiveness, quality, or volume of service than they felt they would have gotten otherwise. This wasn't well controlled. This is retrospective. But it was a pretty well-structured set of interview protocols, about 70 interviews in person, combined with site observations. So we had some triangulation over there. So the data's good. The data shows us little things, like the team's willingness to argue within itself in a polite and appropriate way, had a huge effect. In fact, I remember one place in Nairobi, the team had a habit of just, when they got stuck or were wrestling with something, they would argue, and then they would go and knock on the CEO's door and ask a question. And the CEO said to me, before your students came, no one ever knocked on my door. It was a norm. It's very hierarchical here. It was a norm to work through the channel or to wait for the next meeting and to work up. And then they saw these kids knocking on my door, and then they realized it was good. And now people knock on my door and our whole culture has shifted. So it's really interesting. I'm sure, I actually never told the students this, I'm sure they have no idea that that was one of their kind of big impacts they had on that organization. So that's really interesting. In another case, a little flow chart. We do these patient flow charts sometimes, and we do a lot of these. Ops is a very powerful tool to bring in this setting. So we sometimes do debottlenecking studies, or we do flow improvement studies. And I've worked with many LGO students over the years. So one of our standard tools is just to map patient flow. And the team was using it internally just to kind of organize their thinking and direct their attention. But after we went back 2 years later, and we saw in the clinic had continued to make their own flow charts. And they were using it not only internally, but they actually put it on the wall in the patient waiting room so patients knew what to expect and could hold the providers accountable for process adherence. And this was a huge quality improvement loop for the organization, because now not only did staff feel more focused on and attuned to performance improvement approaches, but the patients themselves saw that. So there's huge value in the projects that are well delivered and the tools that kind of equip people to do things better. Let me tell you about a couple of projects and then move into my insights, because that's what I really want to leave you with. We worked on a platform for micro health insurance with cell phone providers in Kenya last year, where we used a monadic pricing study. We worked on market entry strategies in multiple countries with Gradient to see if they could bring their new anesthesia machine to markets with very poor electricity and bottled oxygen supplies. And this year we worked on spare parts strategies, which is a huge challenge in emerging markets. We worked on reducing wait times at a clinic in Zambia with matched projects. This was last year in India and South Africa, so that we could actually port over the learning from place to place. We looked at appointment keeping behavior in an eye hospital in India that sees about 3 million patients a year. How do you get people to keep their post-op appointments in particular? And we worked on process improvement in a public clinic in South Africa. I won't even go into that one. So those are problem-driven projects that have yielded a lot, on which I've built some of these practices about learning from failure and learning how to do things better. I also realize, though, that if we're only ever doing problem-driven, and maybe this is an insight that links to your own work, if we're only trying to solve problems, we might get stuck in a very incrementalist trap where this is the presenting problem, this is what the client or the host has said is important, and we have to solve this problem given the setup the host has given us. But I kept wondering, what if there's a radically new way to do things that's far beyond the scope of this project? A radically different way to organize how the organization does its business. Maybe we should pair a problem-driven approach with a set of icons, inspirations, and frameworks that would allow us to also think big and think different. So I've also come to believe that effective problem-focused projects need to have somewhere else in the ecosystem a bank of wild and crazy ideas that maybe are linked to some data and rigor behind them so that you're not always doing the incrementalist stuff. So yes, we're helping this tiny little NGO in Uganda, which has no running water or electricity, do better. But here is this hospital chain, in southern India that has figured out how to drive the cost of cataract surgery down by 3 orders of magnitude. They seem so different, but maybe there's some practices we can borrow from the eye hospital in India that could apply in Uganda. So I felt like it's really important to have both those pieces on offer, and for me to have a sense of both of them, so that we could both attend to the focal problem, but have in mind that there are these future trajectories and bigger possibilities out there that could inspire us and that we could learn from. So lately, when I go to companies, I ask them that, like, what do you think about how do you find those very different ideas about how you could run your organization or do your business? And especially in the nonprofit world, I find that there's a real dearth of knowledge about radically different ways to organize how you do things. People tend to be very kind of much in their own setting and in their own mode of operation. Because of that, in the book, along with the MIT alums that were my sort of original idea as the spur for finding out how to do things better, I decided to look at an organization from my class that was effective. So I picked the one that's probably the most surprising, which is BRAC. BRAC is a Bangladeshi NGO. So it started in Dhaka in Bangladesh right after the war with Pakistan in 1972. Who would have thought that that small, crisis response organization is now the world's largest NGO, delivers healthcare to 127 million people. It runs 40,000 schools. It's like 80+% self-sustaining. It has 50 for-profit businesses. And it's this incredible learning machine that learns amid the most challenging resource constraints, figures out how to do things better. So learning from real-world organizations that do things better is, I think, a fascinating companion to that kind of micro stuff of how you better plan for reflection, form your hypotheses, take targeted action to test your ideas. Can we do both of those things? So the core idea that I want to leave you with is that to do better, you need a method. And I'm going to hit on a couple of key features of this method that I would love you to both think about and offer me your feedback on. To innovate, you've got to know the rationale that's undergirding why you're doing what you're doing, your theory of change, your mental model, your causal loop diagram. Why are we doing this? So that even if you can't attend to everything on this kind of map, everyone on the team is oriented towards it. And when you encounter a surprise, you can flag it and link it to what you see. You need to know where you can take a risk and where you can't. Many people don't ask that question about their project. They kind of take the deliverables as a given and then maybe step on a minefield without realizing it, or don't color outside the lines and miss an opportunity to innovate. So think about where you can take a risk and fail better. And then cultivate this practice of looking at your experience within your team. If you guys are taking action, how do you gather data on it? I have my students fill out a Google Doc every Monday morning at 8 a.m., and they hate it. because it's relentless. You know, they're already doing assignments, they're already doing all these other things, but I ask them about 4 questions every Monday. What it's doing is forcing them to gather data just by putting it down, even just by contemporaneous documentation, just writing a page every Monday. They get together, they look at that data, they check in with each other. But even more valuable I found is when I print out all 14 weeks of these thoughts, questions, responses, they are flabbergasted. I had this like aha moment on the last day of class when I handed each student the printout of each of their journeys. I had no idea this happened. I didn't even remember we took that, wrong turn. I forgot about that dead end. Or remember we got stuck on this idea. You miss that because as you go, especially when you're performance oriented, you're looking at that deliverable and you're all putting everything into what goes into that final deck. But you can't lead, change, and teach if you don't also talk about the journey there. So building a team habit for collecting data as you go equips you to do that later. So we talk about launching your project well. In the midst of every project, this is something I have the luxury of as an instructor. But I wonder if you can implement it in your own teams or even for yourself. How do you kind of design your action so that you're testing your core ideas early and often, gathering data as you go, and choosing those drill down moments in your project journey where you're willing to re-examine what you're doing and why. This was driven by my early projects with students where we got to the end. I remember we did one with Boston Ballet. We got to the end of the project and the student said, I knew it was going to fail. Like, it's not going to happen, and I knew it. I said, when did you know? I probably knew, he was thinking, probably knew in week 3. Why didn't you say anything? Well, I wasn't yet sure. And we'd already scoped it. By the time we got to week 7, it was already scoped and nailed down. Like, I hadn't equipped him, but he also felt like he was locked in. And then he sort of engaged in a lot of wishful thinking. And I thought maybe things would turn around, like they were going to bring in a new person, maybe she would change the balance. But the truth is, we actually could have predicted very early on that that project wasn't going to add value. And I bet some of you have done projects like that yourselves in your own work lives. So how do we find that? I think part of the discipline is when you're engaging in a project to pick moments where you're willing to re-examine your plans. To do that, you probably need to, in the early stage, set up an agreement with your stakeholders. We're going to gather data as we go. And by the way, we're going to have 3 check-in moments, and let's look then if we're at the right path. And let's be willing to pivot. Let's be willing to speed up or scale up the project, or even cut it off if need be. Like, think about how you're going to do that. And finally, embed. I've talked a lot about embedding. One of our practices here is to share lessons learned or experiences with each other. But as I said earlier, you won't really get very far unless you can calibrate those insights by looking also at results and outcomes. Think carefully about what actually hindered or helped. I'm a big fan of not only looking at the big ideas, here's what we can do with mobile payments in, Bangladesh or whatever, those big market shifting ideas, but the little ones too. Here's how to run a meeting effectively. Here's how to do emails better. Here's how to eliminate wasted time in this stage of the process. So look at habits and practices as well as insights and knowledge. And then figure out how to share those discoveries. Something that managers and leaders need to reward and that individuals need to take on board. If you want to be a professional contributor, if you want to change the world, think about how you're going to pull out and share your lessons learned. And find your platform. Maybe it's a blog post. Maybe it's speaking to others. Maybe it's tweeting. I don't know. There are lots of different ways we have today to share your insights. But find a way to share your insights that allows you to get feedback so that you can really examine everything you do from the lens of pulling out what it means for yourself and for others. And I've put all these ideas up online as a set of checklists. Kara, my former student, and I built these out ourselves based on our own experience. She had been my student and then my TA. And after she graduated, we actually kept writing. We would just write books and no workbooks. and screeds, I guess, that no one would read. And we realized we actually really feel that we have some ideas and methods we want to share. So luckily, we've been able to put them in a book, but we plan to keep putting these new ideas up online. And finally, I want to say one word about mindset. Systems thinking is a core discipline here at MIT Sloan, learning how to think about how all the pieces are connected and think about the time frames that you're operating in more explicitly. Also, take the step that's required to really make failure work by helping yourself and others to talk about it. We're not born knowing how to talk about failure, so sometimes you're going to need to be kind and helpful to others. It's easy to hear someone struggling to talk about a failure and think ill of them, either because they're not explaining it well or they might seem self-serving. So extend the benefit of the doubt and help them figure it out, because it's something I think we all need to do to make our own work lives, our own families, our own companies, our own society better. And if we do that, think of what we could do. If we could actually learn from the failures that we've planned because they're testing a core idea, the failures that got in somehow because we didn't think things through, or the failures that happened just because things played out the way they did, if we had a better method of both planning for and learning from them, the world would be a much better place. I think we're out of time now, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, either right now, quickly, if you have time as you get up and move around, or send me an email, sastry@mit.edu. Thank you so much.